Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, welcome back to the channel. It's me, it's AOB, coming back at you with yet another video. Yes, I know I'm very inconsistent, but you should be used to it now, all 47 subscribers of mine. Just know that content comes at any moment. Who knows? It could be within the next week, it could be in the next year, who knows? But it's coming. Now, I'm still trying to recover from the whole Spider-Man leaving the MCU news, but I'm going to try and put on a brave face for this video, try and bring some positivity in the world regarding Spider-Man, because ever since the Sony and Disney deal broke down, Spider-Man has been shrouded in nothing but negativity. But now, I'm just going to try and give positive vibes. He's one of my favourite characters of all time. He is my all-time favourite superhero. And having all this negativity from myself about my own favourite superhero, it just doesn't make sense. I love the character so much, so having so much negativity surrounding him just doesn't make sense to me. So I'm just going to try and talk positively about Spider-Man for a change. Let's do this. Let's bring some positivity back to Spider-Man, eh? In this video, I am finally going to do my first ever ranking video. I have wanted to do ranking videos for such a long time now, but I just haven't had the time. But now I have the time, and I've got the list. Here's what we're going to do. I'm going to rank all the Spider-Man movies from my least favourite to my all-time favourite. Now, of course, this is just my personal ranking, so, you know, it's not fact. Don't take it as this is the definitive ranking, objectively speaking, no questions asked. This is just my personal ranking, so don't get offended if your favourite Spider-Man movie is at the bottom of my list and your least favourite is at the top of my list. Just don't get offended. Comment down below your personal ranking and we can have a little discussion, a little debate. Let's just have some nice discussions as Spider-Man fans, eh? Let's have a good time, eh? Now, coming in at number 8 and the bottom of the list, my least favourite Spider-Man movie is The Amazing Spider-Man 2. Oh boy, this film has fallen far from grace. When I first saw this movie in the cinema, I was convinced that this is the greatest movie I ever saw in my life. I loved it so much, I was trying to convince myself this is the best movie ever made, it's the best Spider-Man movie ever made, it's the best superhero movie ever made, you're never gonna top The Amazing Spider-Man 2. I was trying really hard to convince myself of that, and I was thinking it in my head, like, yeah, no, this is not true, this is true, it's the greatest film ever made. But deep down, I knew that I was disappointed, and that no, this film is not good at all. And it took me a while to finally get to grips with that and admit it to myself. But I finally did, and now I can safely say with confidence that yes, this is my least favourite Spider-Man movie. I mean, what is there to say about this movie that hasn't already been said? It's a mess. It's a shit tip. The story's all over the place. There's too many villains. There's too many setup to things that don't get a payoff. It's a mess. There are things that I do really like about this movie though. Andrew Garfield as Spider-Man, I think he's great. Especially as Spider-Man. More so as Spider-Man than Peter Parker. He's great as Spider-Man. Andrew Garfield, great. Emma Stone as Gwen Stacy, I still think she's one of the best love interests in the Spider-Man movie. I think her chemistry with Andrew Garfield is great, and I still like watching that chemistry between them. And then there's some good Spider-Man action in there. The best way to watch this movie is to find a compilation on YouTube of all the Amazing Spider-Man 2 action sequences. Because all the Spider-Man scenes are great. Swinging around, all the Spider-Man fighting, it's great. It's great, it's classic Spider-Man. But everything else in between is just a slog. Oh my god. The biggest reason as to why I cannot watch this movie anymore is just because of all of the setup to future movies that didn't happen. This film is just a glorified trailer for future films that Sony desperately wanted to do because they wanted to create their own Spider-Man cinematic universe, which they're trying to sort of do now. But back then, it was just bound to fail, and it wasn't a coherent story with a beginning, middle, and end. It was just setup after setup after setup for the Sinister Six and for the Amazing Spider-Man 3. And I can't watch this film anymore because there's so much setup with no resolution that it ends, and you're like, well, obviously these films didn't happen, so there's no resolution. So when you watch this film, it just sort of ends kind of openly. Like, it sets up so much that doesn't get resolved, and it just tarnishes it entirely. Like, I haven't watched it in ages just because of all the setup that doesn't get a payoff. That's why I can't watch this anymore. I haven't watched this film in a long time. Out of all the Spider-Man movies, this is the one that I have not watched in about 3 years maybe, and that's the biggest reason why. But all the other reasons as well. As I said, the story's a mess. Too many villains. They repeated the same mistake as Spider-Man 3. For some reason, they had too many villains again. He had Jamie Foxx as Electro. I liked Jamie Foxx's performance as Max Dillon, up until he became Electro, and then he just becomes a generic villain with no interesting character motivations whatsoever. But up until that point, I liked how he played Max Dillon. He was this timid, nervous nerd guy who gets walked all over. That was potential good setup for him to just snap and become a villain. But when he becomes Electro and there's that Times Square scene where Peter Parker's trying to talk to him, and then the cameras go on to Spider-Man, and then all of a sudden Max Dillon just switches personality entirely, and he just becomes a generic bad guy who just is like, I'm gonna live in a world without Spider-Man, blah, 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 blah. Just like, where did this come from? This is not earned whatsoever. His turn was not earned at all. It was just out of nowhere, and then once he became the villain, he was just really uninteresting, and he just became so generic. I still preface to this day that Dane DeHaan would be a great Harry Osborn. It's just the script for this movie didn't allow for him to give a good performance, because the whole film he's just throwing a temper tantrum the entire time. And then you've got Paul Giamatti as Rhino, which the less said about that guy, the better. And all of the setup to future movies that didn't happen in this film just really affects the rewatchability, and it's just, it's fallen far. It's gone from my all-time favourite movie at the time to just way down to the bottom of the barrel. It is easily the worst Spider-Man movie in my opinion, so there's that. Coming in at number 7 on my list is The Amazing Spider-Man. Yes, this one is quite low compared to a lot of other lists that I've seen, but it's just how it is, guys. I don't think this is a bad movie at all. I don't think it's a bad movie. I think the biggest crime that this movie has is that it's just bland. It's not very interesting. Visually, it's not very interesting to look at. And, you know, it plays it very safe. You had the retelling of the origin story again, which felt very redundant, especially so soon after the Raimi trilogy. And it was just very mundane to me. I mean, the colour scheme of the film, it's really dark and grainy. And the biggest crime that this film commits is the fact that besides one scene, the first person scene, and one scene where Spider-Man is on the roof of a building when he first wears his proper costume, there are no scenes during the daytime when he's Spider-Man. That is the biggest offence of all. Like 90% of this movie is set at nighttime. Why did they do that? It just made the film so uninteresting, and it doesn't fit with Spider-Man as a character whatsoever. Now I know why they did it. They were trying to be a gritty, modern, realistic take on Spider-Man. You know, it was very inspired by The Dark Knight. You want to be dark, gritty, sort of grounded in realism in a way. And that's why they ultimately set it at night time and all that. But, man, it's just, this film plays it very safe. It doesn't really have its own voice. Mark Webb directed this and The Amazing Spider-Man 2. At least with The Amazing Spider-Man 2, that film was colourful. I felt like Mark Webb put more of his sort of own flavour in the film, like more of his personality. Yes, he was still being told by the heads at Sony what to put in there and what to do, but visually, I felt like Mark Webb actually put his own stamp on it. In this film, man, there was no... It was just like anybody could have directed this. There was no distinct personality to this film whatsoever, and it was just a generic sort of origin story with nothing special. It's a good origin story, it's a good film, but it's generic, it plays it very safe, and that's just... I just find it very, very uninteresting and bland compared to all the other Spider-Man films that go above this. Same with The Amazing Spider-Man 2. I loved this movie when it first came out. I was like, this is the best Spider-Man movie ever made. I'm a Spider-Man fanboy, so anytime I would come out of a new Spider-Man movie, it was automatically the best one every time. But good things in this movie. Andrew Garfield, great as always. He was great in this and in The Amazing Spider-Man 2. I think Andrew Garfield was great. You could tell he had a passion and a love for the character that he was trying to bring into it. Emma Stone as well, great. The chemistry between Peter Parker and Gwen Stacy in this film is good to watch. They have genuinely good chemistry. And again, I'll reiterate, I think Emma Stone's Gwen Stacy is probably the best love interest we've had in the Spider-Man franchise. I even think Kurt Connors is a bit underrated. When he's Kurt Connors, and not the Lizard, I think he's a really interesting character. Rhys Ifans, however you say his name, plays it really well. I think he's a really interesting character, but then when he becomes a Lizard, that's when he becomes a generic bad guy who wants to turn New York City into lizards. Like, okay, that's fine, do what you want to do, Lizard, I guess. There was some interesting bits of setup, you know, not like The Amazing Spider-Man 2, you know, you had the foundations built for, you know, all of the Spider-Man lore, you know, with Oscorp and, you know, mentions of Norman Osborn and all that stuff. It wasn't as ham-fisted as The Amazing Spider-Man 2. This film actually had a clear cut beginning, middle and end. Yeah, part of it is just that it plays it very safe, it doesn't have its own voice, it's just another origin story so soon after the Raimi trilogy, after we just saw one really. But whenever I feel like watching a Spider-Man movie, I very, very rarely go to this one. I will always go to the ones that I rank above this more than this one, just because it's just not the most exciting movie in the bunch, and that's why it comes at number 7 on my list. Coming in at number 6 is Spider-Man 3. Yes, this was bound to be in the lower section of my ranking like everybody else's. But to be fair, in the list from here on out, it ranges from liking them to liking them a lot to loving them. So, you know, here we go. What can I say about Spider-Man 3 that hasn't been said already? Everything. I can only reiterate what everybody says about Spider-Man 3. It's bloated. It's trying to do too much in one movie. I feel like this film would have benefited from being split into 2 parts. Especially with the symbiote storyline, if you had the first part be Spider-Man in the black suit for like majority of the film, and at the end of it he takes it off, and then the second part, that's when you introduce Venom as the main villain and have that story be told in like a second part. I feel like it would have been really, really good if they'd split this into 2 parts and done it that way. But yeah, you know, you've got too many villains in this. You've got Harry Osborn as Goblin, you've got Sandman, and then obviously in the last like 10 minutes you've got Venom. Compared to Amazing Spider-Man 2 though, while that does have too many villains, that's got 3 villains and this is 3 villains, at least with this one, it tries to flesh the villains out more. So, you know, you've got Harry Osborn as Goblin, who we've had 2 movies preceding this to get to know, and it was building up to him becoming Goblin. So, you know, when it happened, we understand and we know why, and there's all that development there. Sandman, you know, they try and give some sympathy to that character by having him have a daughter, and he's trying to steal money for his sick daughter, and you can, for me anyway, I do sympathise with him. And then obviously the weaker of the bunch is Eddie Brock when he eventually becomes Venom. At least they try to give a reason as to why he hates Peter Parker, and then when he finally bonds with the symbiote, you know, you can see why he's going after him. It's not done very well, but you can see why he is going after Spider-Man Peter Parker. But yeah, this film is just trying to do too much in one movie. You've got the whole infamous when black suit Spider-Man, when he's emo Peter Parker with his hair like this, walking down the street and all that. People used to hate this way back then, but now people love this film, ironically. It has become such a meme now that it is more entertaining than it is bad. A few years ago, people hated this movie. They were like, this film shat on the Spider-Man franchise. What was it doing? But now, people look at it fondly because it is so entertaining, and it's become such a meme now that people can just look at it and appreciate it for what it is and just laugh at it. And that's better than what The Amazing Spider-Man 2 gets. That's better than just hating it because it's just a shit movie. But there are good things in this movie. I think, you know, even when he's the emo Peter Parker, I think Tobey Maguire is always good in these films. Kirsten Dunst is, she's sometimes a bit iffy. She's a bit of a bastard in this film. But there are lots of good things in this movie. You know, you've got the Sandman scene where he becomes Sandman for the first time. That is a beautiful scene. The music is just beautiful. I think a lot of the Spider-Man action in this is actually really, like, a lot of the Spider-Man action is great in this, especially when he's got the black suit on. Yes, a lot of the CGI is very dated. The CGI in this is worse than the CGI in Spider-Man 1 and 2. I don't know what happened. Even back then, it was noticeable and you could tell it was CGI. I remember watching this in the cinema as a kid and thinking, ooh, that looks a bit fake. I don't know what happened there. I don't know where the budget went, but the CGI isn't very good in this movie at all, and it's even worse now. But this film goes above Amazing Spider-Man 2 and Amazing Spider-Man 1 because it is entertaining. Whether it's in a good way or a bad way, it doesn't matter. It's still entertaining in some way or another. And there are legitimately good bits in this film that are entertaining in a legitimately good way from a filmmaking standpoint. But it is so entertaining to watch. And I think partly because it's become such a meme now and people just laugh at it now. You can just watch it with people and friends and just have a bloody good time when watching it. It's great. The biggest crime that this film commits, though, is the characterization of Venom. Venom is my all-time favourite Spider-Man villain, or one of my all-time favourite Spider-Man characters, because he's not really a villain anymore. But what they did with Venom in this was criminal. I remember being so excited for this film as a kid before it came out, and seeing not reading magazines, but just looking at film magazines, looking at pictures of Venom, and just being so excited to see Venom in a film. and I could not wait. And at the time, I was doing my usual. I was convincing myself, like, no, Venom great. It's Venom. It's Venom. It's Venom. And while Venom looked great, the character was just no. Topher Grace as Eddie Brock, that was questionable. Where did that come from? I don't know who I don't know who else they could have cast as Eddie Brock, but you know, someone a bit more intimidating than Topher Grace. Topher Grace didn't play it very well at all. You even got Gwen Stacy in this movie, which I forget about every time. I just remember now that Gwen Stacy's in this movie. Wow. Every time I watch this movie and Gwen Stacy turns up, I was like, oh yeah, shit, Gwen Stacy's in this. I totally forgot. But overall, I find this film very entertaining. I can watch it quite a lot. Whenever I go to watch a Spider-Man movie, this is one that I might go to quite often. Just the whole stuff they did with Venom, I didn't like. It was just not Venom at all. And the story being a bit bloated, trying to do too much with the symbiote storyline and the Sandman storyline and the whole Harry Osborn Goblin storyline all in one movie, just making it a bit muddled. And that's why this film comes in at number 6 on my ranking. Now, scratch what I said before about from Spider-Man 3 onwards, I go from liking a lot to loving the Spider-Man movies. It's actually from here that I love the Spider-Man movies. Now, coming in at my number 5, will probably be criminally low for a lot of people who watch this and are Spider-Man fans. But this is my list, so put your pitchforks down. Coming in at number 5 is Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse. Yes, I think a lot of people will consider this to be way too low for this film because a lot of people consider this to be the best Spider-Man movie out there. And I can see why people think that, but for me personally, I love it. I just don't think it's just not my personal favourite Spider-Man movie. This film is just paced perfectly. It just, from the opening scene, it's paced perfectly. And the animation, man. The animation style in this movie, it was a comic book come to life. And I cannot get over how many people thought the animation style looked shit. Like, so many of my friends who are casual superhero fans had no interest in seeing this movie purely because it was animated, and I just think that's not fair. Just watch it. It's such a good movie. Miles Morales. This did Miles Morales justice. I don't really know much about Miles Morales. I casually know stuff about Miles Morales. I've never read a Miles Morales comic book, but you know, I know the basics about him. As someone who's never read anything Miles Morales related, this got me invested in in his character so much, and I loved Miles in this film. And of course we had all the different Spider-Men, the big gimmick of this movie with the different versions of Spider-Man, and the best, of course, out of all those Spider-Men was Nicolas Cage as Spider-Man Noir. Who knew? I bet Nicolas Cage was so happy that he was cast in this film doing the voice of a Spider-Man, and he was perfect as Spider-Man Noir. He was hilarious in this film. That's another thing I love about this movie. It's hilarious. This is the funniest Spider-Man movie out of them all. And it's just, I can't get over how funny this movie is. But I do love all the other Spider people as well. You know, you got Miles Morales, who was great. Peter B. Parker, what a performance! I can't remember the actor's name who does the voice of Peter B. Parker in this, but he was just so good. Gwen Stacy as Spider-Gwen. Holy guacamole! Spider-Gwen, I was surprised at how much I liked Spider-Gwen in this. But yeah, the thing that makes this movie is just the characters. The characters it's so good to watch them going back and forth. Also, the story is just told so well. It's so fast-paced. You'd have thought with a story like this, you know, incorporating so many different Spider-Man and a whole multiverse kind of story, you thought it could have ended up being very messy and muddled, but actually it was told really, really smoothly. And I think telling it from the perspective of Miles Morales and then them coming into him was the best way to do it. But yeah, I don't know what else to say about this movie. It's so rewatchable. The animation is spectacular. The characters are great. The build up to Miles Morales finally becoming Spider-Man, him finally getting his costume, is done so well. I also love the chemistry between Peter B. Parker and Miles Morales, and him trying to teach Miles how to be Spider-Man. I liked the different takes on the iconic Spider-Man villains that we got, like Doc Ock and Goblin and Kingpin. That's probably the weaker point of this film, is that I don't think Kingpin was very interesting as a villain. He definitely wasn't as interesting as the Prowler. Prowler was great, and Aaron Davis, Miles' uncle, the whole stuff with Miles and his uncle was great, and I got emotional when Aaron gets killed in this film. It's really emotional, hits me where I live. But I think the weaker point of this movie is the Kingpin. Yes, there is some sympathy there. He just wants to get his family back from another dimension because his family died, but he's not really in the film that much. And when he's on screen, He just acts a bit generic. He's just like a bit of a generic villain guy. I like his look though. The design of him is ridiculously over the top and cartoony, but you know, you can tell it's Kingpin. But yeah, I know a lot of you will consider this to be criminally low on my ranking, but I still love this movie, and as I said, from here, I love all the Spider-Man movies on my list. It's just, I've got to pick some over the others to make this list happen, and this is just where it is, because when I go to rewatch Spider-Man movies, this isn't the one that I come to most. There are ones higher in this list that I come to more often. But yes, Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse is my number 5 pick. Coming in at number 4, it is the classic, the iconic Spider-Man, the original, directed by Sam Raimi, starring Tobey Maguire. How can I not love this movie? Nostalgia. This film just reigns with nostalgia. Yes, you'll consider that to be cheating, but yes, part of it is that it's just nostalgia. I watched this film over and over and over and over again as a kid, and this is the film that got me into Spider-Man. Like, if it wasn't for this film, I wouldn't love Spider-Man as much as I do now. I have to give great appreciation to this film for introducing me to Spider-Man as a concept and as a character. And I didn't even discover the 90s animated series until like after I'd already watched this film. I just came across it on TV. I was like, oh my god, that's Spider-Man, like the movie. So without this film, I wouldn't love Spider-Man as much as I do. This film is a classic, and it paved the way for all the superhero movies that we have now. If it wasn't for this film, we wouldn't have the MCU. We wouldn't have like the DCEU, as sort of messy as that is. We wouldn't have all of these amazing superhero movies that we have now if it wasn't for this film. And the MCU being my all-time favourite film franchise, it probably wouldn't exist if this movie didn't happen, and I just cannot get over how much I love this film. I could watch this film over and over and over again. Tobey Maguire is the perfect Peter Parker. Yes, you can question him as Spider-Man. When he's got the suit on and he's Spider-Man, he's not quippy, and I know people complain that he isn't quippy enough. And you know, I agree, yeah, he's not quippy enough. He's not iconic Spider-Man that we all know and love. But as Peter Parker, he still smashes it out of the park as Peter Parker. You can just buy him as this nerdy kid in school. Yes, he might look a bit too old now when watching back. You're like, I don't really buy that you're a high school kid. But a lot of the kids in this movie are kids. He probably looks more like a kid than the rest of the so-called kids in this film. So I think he's more believable as a high school student than a lot of the other actors in this. The Spider-Man suit. God, I love this Spider-Man suit. It's iconic. I know I haven't talked about Spider-Man suits in the other films, but, you know, I can't talk about this without talking about how classic the costume is in this film. So perfect. Willem Dafoe, man, that guy, he was having such a good time in this film, and you can tell he's just radiating joy, and he's just having such a good time in this movie. It's so good. Yes, the costume, the Goblin costume, is not... It's crap. It's not good at all. But his performance just lets me overlook that, because every time he's on screen, it's hilarious. He can be intimidating, and he's just Willem Dafoe having a blast, and he's a classic villain, is the Green Goblin in this. This is the first time we see J.K. Simmons as J. Jonah Jameson. Holy shizzle fo dizzle. How can you can't cast any more perfectly than that. There are like J.K. Simmons as J. Jonah Jameson. I am so glad that they brought him back to play J. Jonah Jameson in Spider-Man Far From Home, because my god, they obviously realised, yeah, you cannot cast anyone else to play J. Jonah Jameson. Do you know how often I watch J. Jonah Jameson compilations on YouTube? I watch them all the freaking time, and I can't get enough of him. This film is just... I love this film, but I'm more grateful to it than I am anything else. It was my go-to film as a kid. I love it so much. If it wasn't for this film, we wouldn't have all the superhero movies we have now. There's just such an influence on me as a person. Just such a classic, and I don't know what else I could possibly say. It's great, and I can watch it over and over again. This might be considered quite low, considering how much I'm praising it, but this just shows how much I love the other movies that go above this compared to this one. If I'm praising this as much as I am now, imagine how much praise I'm going to give these next ones. Such a classic, iconic. Love it. Now these top three was so hard for me to choose in this order because it interchanges so much. My number 3 pick tomorrow might be my number 1 pick. They might just swap places so often, but for right now, this is how it's going. My number 3 pick is currently Spider-Man Homecoming. Yeah, Spider-Man Homecoming is my number 3 pick, and for the longest time this was my number 1. I think part of the reason this goes so high is because the novelty of Spider-Man in the MCU has just not worn off for me, and the novelty is still there. Just watching this film, Spider-Man in the MCU, a dream come true. When the news came out that Spider-Man was going to finally be introduced into the MCU, I cried. I'm not even kidding, I cried tears of joy. And this was the first Spider-Man film set within the MCU after seeing him in Civil War for the first time. This is one of the most rewatchable films in the MCU for me. I can watch this film over and over again. Well, just like all the other Spider-Man films at the top of this list. Tom Holland is, for me, the definitive Spider-Man and Peter Parker. He is the perfect... It's a generic thing to say, but he is the perfect mix of Tobey Maguire and Andrew Garfield. He's got the perfect mixture of Tobey Maguire's nerdiness as Peter Parker, and he's got the perfect sort of wittiness as Andrew Garfield as Spider-Man. He is the perfect definitive Spider-Man. For me, is Tom Holland. Michael Keaton as Vulture, one of the best villains in the MCU. Michael Keaton, man, Michael Keaton just knows how to be intimidating. When he hasn't got the suit on, he's more intimidating without his Vulture suit on than he is with the Vulture suit on. And that's just how good Michael Keaton is in this film. And in this film, this is the closest thing to getting a perspective of the whole MCU from like a street level, from like an everyday person's level. I mean, obviously, yeah, it's from the perspective of a teenager, but he's a normal kid. He lives in a normal like neighborhood. It's from a normal civilian's perspective, just seeing what the MCU's like from that perspective, and it's just something that was so different at the time. And it's just such an interesting take on the MCU. What I love about this as well is that it's an origin story, but not an origin story, if that makes sense. It's an origin story in the sense that we don't see the origin of how he gets the powers. We don't see him getting bitten by the spider and all that, and Uncle Ben and all that. We don't see that. But it's still kind of an origin in the sense that he's only been Spider-Man for a few months. He's still sort of getting to grips with his powers. He still makes a lot of mistakes. And by the end of the film, he finally sort of becomes his own, and he sort of realises how to be the best Spider-Man he can be. He still has a lot of growing to do, but but by the end of the movie he matures, and he goes from being like this kid who thinks he can sort of do whatever he thinks he can do as Spider-Man, thinking he doesn't need school, he doesn't need this life, to by the end maturing and realising, you know what, I can be Spider-Man without these gadgets, without all this, I can do it. The scene that makes this movie it made me tear up, is the scene where he's under all the rubble. The Vulture has knocked the building on top of him, and he's screaming for help. That he's just a kid and he's stuck, and then he sees his iconic reflection of the half mask in his face, and then he says, "Come on, Spider-Man," and he lifts up that rubble, and I love that scene so much. I can't get enough of it. Absolutely adore this film. One of my favourites. One of my favourite films in the MCU. Top 10, maybe top 5, I'm not quite sure. Spider-Man Homecoming coming in at number 3. Okay, coming in at number 2 is, oh god, I'm starting to change my mind at the last minute, am I? Coming in at number 2 is Spider-Man Far From Home. Spider-Man Far From Home is coming in at my number 2. Oh, that was hard. I was just sort of doubting myself, like, do I want this number 2? I don't want the number 1 pick to be number 2, blah, 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 you know, I don't know. Spider-Man Far From Home is my number 2, I'm going with that for now. This was my number 1 for the longest time since I saw it. It's swapped again. I told you, these always interchange, so at the minute, Far From Home is my number 2. I feel like Spider-Man Far From Home was the perfect epilogue to Avengers Endgame, and it was the best way to take Spider-Man after Spider-Man Homecoming, and it was different as well, you know. After initially hearing that this film wasn't going to be set in New York, it was going to be set in Europe, I was really quite disappointed, because while we have had Spider-Man in the MCU, we haven't really had like proper Spider-Man swinging through New York City MCU Spider-Man, you know? We haven't had like the iconic Spider-Man in proper New York City stopping crime and swinging through the city. You know, we got glimpses of it in like Avengers Infinity War and stuff, but we still haven't really had MCU Spider-Man being the iconic New York superhero that he is. And this film being set in Europe was like, we're still not going to get like the iconic New York setting for Spider-Man. You need Spider-Man in New York. Spider-Man and New York go hand in hand, like why are they doing that? But the fact that I was worried about that, and then I watched this movie and then I loved it as much as I did, is just a testament to how good this movie is and how much I loved it. Tom Holland is as ever, proves time and time again with every film that he appears in why he is the best Spider-Man, why he's my personal favourite. He just encapsulates everything that makes Spider-Man, Spider-Man, and I just can't get enough of watching him. Zendaya as MJ had more to do in this film, and I really liked Zendaya as MJ in this film. I liked her in Spider-Man Homecoming, but she didn't do much. She was just this character sort of in the background making the odd comment here and there, but in this film, she really gets a lot of development, and the chemistry between her and Tom Holland is up there with the chemistry between Andrew Garfield and Emma Stone. I think her and Tom Holland had amazing chemistry. And unlike a lot of the romances in superhero movies and in MCU movies as well, the romance in this film, I actually bought into this romance. In a lot of superhero movies, the romantic interest subplot is always usually my least favourite part of the movie, or it's the least interesting, because, you know, it's like, it feels like they have to tick it off the box, you know. Oh yeah, this is a story, we need to tick off the whole romantic interest box. Yeah, we'll get a romantic interest in there, just throw it in, just because it needs to be there. But with this, Zendaya and Tom Holland's chemistry, and by the end when they actually get together, it was really cute and I really bought into it. It actually felt like a young teenager's relationship. And because this wasn't going to be set in New York, I was thinking, well, how are we going to get some decent Spider-Man action in this? Because, you know, Spider-Man action is usually him swinging through New York, fighting crime in New York City, swinging around, doing all of his business. But this has some of the best Spider-Man action in any Spider-Man movie, and it shocked me. I was like, wow, we've got a lot of Spider-Man action in this, way more than I thought we would have done, and I can't get over how surprised it was at how much Spider-Man action we got in this. And I cannot talk about this film without talking about Jake Gyllenhaal as Mysterio. Holy shit. Wow. Spoiler alert, Mysterio, next to Thanos, is my favourite MCU villain. Mysterio was perfect. All of the illusion sequences in this film with Mysterio and Spider-Man was absolutely perfect. It was just straight from the comic books and the animated series. It was just iconic Mysterio illusions going on in live action. The Mysterio sequences in this film were absolutely perfect, and Mysterio as a villain, Jake Gyllenhaal absolutely knocked it out of the park. He is my favourite MCU solo villain. Absolutely love him. I kind of hope we see him again. I know he's supposed to have died. Well, now he's not in the MCU anymore. We don't know what's going to happen. I would have been more than happy to have him come back. Jake Gyllenhaal, so good as Mysterio. And the connections to other MCU movies that we got in this film was so good, man. And even though going into this film you knew that Mysterio was going to ultimately be a villain, like, they tried hiding it, they tried having him look like he's a good guy from an alternate Earth. And then after a while I was starting to think, hang on, is he the villain? We're like nearly at the halfway point of the film and he's still not been revealed to be the villain. Like, is it? And just as I was starting to doubt that he was going to be a villain, that's when he reveals, oh, he's actually a villain. And it was that scene where we have all the connections to the MCU that we've had in the past. We had the guy from Iron Man 1 who Obadiah Stane yells at, like, Tony Stark was able to build this in a cave with a box of scraps. That guy came back. Who would have thought that was ever going to happen? He would come back in a recurring side villain role. Like, what? That was unexpected and nothing but a pleasant surprise. And then obviously it was revealed that Quentin Beck, well, Quentin Beck isn't even his real name, that was a made-up alias from the story he told, but Quentin Beck, I'll just refer to him as Quentin, but then that's when it's revealed that Quentin was actually working for Tony Stark, and he's the one who created the Barf Tech, and he uses the Barf Tech to create his illusions and all that jazz, which was a perfect way to integrate a modern take of Mysterio into the MCU. Like, you couldn't have done that any better, and it's yet another villain that's caused by the actions of Tony Stark, because Tony Stark fired him for being too unstable or something. I was like, whoa, Tony Stark, you really know how to make them villains, don't you? And the ending swing sequence of Spider-Man Far From Home, where we finally get MCU, Spider-Man swinging through the proper New York City, that end swing sequence. That's all I ever wanted from MCU Spider-Man ever since he was introduced, because we haven't really had that properly. I mean, they brought Spider-Man out of New York into Europe because it's different. You know, we want to play around with Spider-Man interacting in a different environment to what he's used to. And I'm thinking, that's all well and good, but we've only ever had one MCU Spider-Man movie where it's actually set in New York, and that's Spider-Man Homecoming. And even then, it's not even like the big city landscape of New York. It was just in Queens, like one of the smaller areas of New York. And we didn't get any of that iconic Spider-Man action. And then in Civil War, he was in Germany. In Infinity War, he's in space. And then in Endgame, he was in the destroyed Avengers compound. So we haven't really had much of MCU Spider-Man in New York, to be honest. But I still love this movie. It didn't disappoint. I was happier with it than I thought I would have been. And it's one of the best Spider-Man movies for me. Absolutely loved it. So this obviously narrows it down. My number one, if you haven't guessed already, is obviously Spider-Man 2. Oh boy, this was tough. Spider-Man 2 is just one of the best movies ever made. It's structured perfectly. The big thing that makes this film as good as it is all the stuff with Peter Parker. This film lays down on Peter Parker. He is just, nothing is going well for him. Being Spider-Man is causing his life to be miserable, and it's ultimately making him question whether he even wants to be Spider-Man anymore, and then ultimately he gives up being Spider-Man. He loses all the passion to be Spider-Man, so much so to a point that he loses his powers, and that was just a perfect story to tell, and it is told so brilliantly. This film just wails on this guy, and you feel so sorry for him. You kind of want him to just take a break from being Spider-Man so he can finally get what he wants in life. He deserves it. This film is just, it's a classic, it's iconic, and it's a sequel done right. This is how you do a sequel. It took everything that made the first movie great, and it amplified it times 10. It told an entirely new story, and we got Doc Ock, Alfred Molina as Doc Ock, one of the best villains in any comic book movie we've ever had. Absolutely killed it as Doc Ock. And this film, obviously, it has probably the best Spider-Man action that we've ever had in a Spider-Man movie. I think there has yet to be a Spider-Man movie that tops any of the action in this. You got the opening pizza delivery scene, which has become a meme now in itself. The train scene, oh my god, the train scene, I think that is one of the best scenes in any comic book movie, period. And the Spider-Man movie has yet to really top that train scene. My god, that train scene is just immaculate. Not only is this a good superhero movie, this is just an amazing movie in its own right. It's such a well-told, well-paced, well-written movie, and I just cannot get enough of how amazing. I just cannot get enough of watching this film over and over again. And I love the extended cut as well, with the different alternate scenes, the fight scenes, like the fight on the building after the bank robbery. The extended version of that is just fantastic. I don't know why it ever got cut out. It's one of the funniest Spider-Man movies. The humour in this movie is great. It's just Sam Raimi, man. He knows how to tell a good Spider-Man story, and he proved it with Spider-Man 2. Spider-Man 2 is just the highest high that Spider-Man has been. And Spider-Man is still high. Like I told you, my top 3 always alternate. It's not that Spider-Man Homecoming and Spider-Man Far From Home aren't top-tier Spider-Man, because they are top-tier Spider-Man. It's just for the time being, for me personally, Spider-Man 2 just edges them both very slightly. Only very slightly, because I struggle to choose between these. I love all these equally, to be honest. But Spider-Man 2 just has got the best writing, it's got the best action, it's just got so much going for it, and I absolutely adore Spider-Man 2. One of the best superhero movies ever made, and just one of the best movies ever made, period. Spider-Man 2, I love you so much. Woo! So, guys, that's it. That is my Spider-Man film ranking from worst to best. Oh man, that is really hard to do, especially when you get to the top 3 or 4, man. It's really hard, because I do love me some Spider-Man, as you probably know. But yes, guys, thank you ever so much for watching. Please do disagree with me or agree with me. Put your own personal ranking in the comments. Just what you would put, what Spider-Man movie and where, why you disagree with me, why you might agree with me. Just put it in the comments. We'll have a nice discussion. Just let's keep it civil, shall we? Because I know that my list is quite unconventional, I think. With some movies anyway. I think some movies people will kick off, especially with Into the Spider-Verse. I think people will kick off that that's quite low. But just put your own list in the comments. Let's have a discussion, let's have a debate, let's keep it fun, shall we? But thank you ever so much for watching. More content to come in the future, more ranking videos, Blu-ray videos, anything I feel like doing, it'll be here. So, ladies and gentlemen, subscribe, hit that notification bell, and ciao for now.